Great, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mika Weinstein. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the CEO for Just Futures. Today, we are talking about aligning your investment portfolio with your mission, using ICE-linked companies and the broader carceral system as a case study. We'll be talking about how foundation endowments and nonprofit reserve funds may be unintentionally invested in companies and industries that undermine the very causes you exist to advance. We'll discuss how to think about mission aligned investing in the context of risk and fiduciary responsibility, and provide some concrete examples and next steps of what it could look like to move to greater alignment. Slide, please. Just a quick disclosure that the material that we're presenting here today is educational. It's not intended to be investment advice. Some of you are already beginning to do this, but please do go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to hear who you are and what you're hoping to get out of the webinar today. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can contact Zoom directly and use the webinar ID provided here to get assistance. We hope that there's a lively discussion in the chat, and to make sure that any questions you have for us make it to our team, we ask that you use the Q&A feature on your webinar toolbar. We have set aside time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, and we'll be using that Q&A tool to source them. All right, so Just Futures is a people of color owned investment advisory firm that's driven by social justice values. We offer retirement plans, so that could be 401k or 403b, employer sponsored plans or IRAs for individuals. And we also do investment management for nonprofit reserves and endowments. And we are, of course, your host today. Our mission is to deliver financial solutions that support a just transition to a regenerative economy. And if you're new to the just transition framework, it is a strategy around shifting from an economy based in extraction and exploitation towards one that is based in mutuality, cooperation, and regeneration. And towards that end, Just Futures is partially owned by a group of 6 nonprofits that are organizing and innovating towards a just transition. I want to share a huge thank you to our numerous co-sponsors for this event. Thank you so much for helping to get the word out there about this event, evidenced by the fact that we have over 100 people in the room right now, which is absolutely amazing to see. That is in large part thanks to you, and we really appreciate your support. So in terms of who you'll be hearing from today, I've already introduced myself. You'll also be hearing from George Guerrero, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Just Futures. We are very lucky to have his deep expertise on our team. He brings his 3-decade career in the financial services industry, including leadership positions in global financial firms, to ensure that our clients are in good hands. And we're also thrilled to have Shirley Leslie join us from Critical Resistance. Shirley is a Belizean Creole genderqueer person from Los Angeles who found a political home in Critical Resistance in 2019. After volunteering through the campaign to shut down the jail at 850 Bryant Street in San Francisco, Shirley joined the Critical Resistance staff as a development coordinator and then transitioned to their national development director in 2022. So thank you in advance, Shirley, for bringing really important grounding to this conversation. I'm going to quickly give you an overview of the agenda. We've done our welcome. Shirley will be helping to set the stage by talking about some sort of foundational pieces around investments and the carceral system. And then we will shift to talking about how you put it into practice. What is involved in creating a mission-aligned investment portfolio. We'll talk about the mission investment paradox. We'll go into some deeper examples with mapping the contradiction, and then we'll share some tools for building alignment. And then as we share it at the end, we'll also engage in some Q&A. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn the mic over to Shirley.
Thanks so much. It's great to see you all. Great to be here in this space with you all today. Meeting some new folks, seeing some familiar names. So really grateful to see you again. My name is Shirley Leslie. As was shared, any pronouns work for me. I am CR's National Development Director, and yes, I'm here repping Critical Resistance, a national grassroots organization. George, if you can hit the next slide, that would be great. So, Critical Resistance is working to build an international movement to end what we call the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We believe that basic necessities such as food, shelter, and freedom are what really make our communities secure. I'll be sure to drop this fuller mission into the chat, and do not worry, I will get more into exactly what the prison industrial complex is in just a minute. So if you can go to the next slide, that would be great. So as I mentioned, we're a national grassroots organization, and we have chapters across the country, all working on a range of campaigns and projects to dismantle systems of imprisonment, policing, immigrant detention, surveillance, and really build up community resistance to systems of criminalization and imprisonment. So you can see on the center bottom, our Oakland and Los Angeles, California chapters are engaged in a campaign to close California prisons. Toward the left, you can see an image from our Portland chapter, who have been seeding the ground for organizing against policing. On the right, our New York City chapter is engaged in a statewide campaign to end ICE contracts with local jails and state prisons all across the state and to push for releases. And our newest regional chapter, CR Central Appalachia, is involved in a campaign to halt the construction of a Kentucky prison, which would be the most expensive federal prison in US history. And that's center top. And so this is just a little bit about us. And again, just want to express gratitude for groups like Just Futures for really helping with mission aligned investments. And again, gratitude to all of you and your willingness to be here to even figure out small steps to take to get your investments out of carceral infrastructure. If we can move to the next slide, that would be great. So, what are we talking about when we say carcerality? I'd like to just start us off with Critical Resistance, or CR's, definition of the prison industrial complex. So, the prison industrial complex, or the PIC, is a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. I won't go into all the contours of this definition and all the concentric circles that you're seeing on the right. We have full 2-hour workshops on that, but I'll keep it a bridge for us today. So we at CR just push ourselves to think much more expansively about the PIC. So when we're talking about the PIC, of course, that includes prisons, and I'd say both private and state-run prisons. But it's not just about prisons, but also the interconnected webs of policing and surveillance that disappear and criminalize people, leading to them being caged. And digging a little bit deeper as well. When we talk about carceral infrastructure, it's not just prisons, but the logics and tools of imprisonment. So in prisons, jails, immigrant detention centers, and in the case of electronic monitoring, even turning people's homes into a cage. So all of these interconnected systems of criminalization and imprisonment need resources to function. And given the sometimes confusing ways that racial capitalism functions, and particularly in terms of investments, it's often hard to see exactly how our individual or organizational resources are tied up in those systems. There are also just a mix of companies from small to large scales that may provide the tools that perpetuate the PIC, and those companies can be mixed up in investment portfolios. So again, harkening back to this definition of the PIC, overlapping interests of government and industry that make the strategies, tools, and infrastructure possible. So I'd like to just share a couple examples that are just very close to home right now in terms of our work at CR. So there are companies that run and or own prisons, but also lots of companies that contract with federal, state, or local carceral facilities. So I'm sure you've heard of some of the heavy hitters like the Geo Group or Core Civic, some really top private prison operators. Um, they're publicly traded companies that issue stocks and bonds that investors and fund managers purchase for those for their portfolios. And potentially passively and inadvertently, I'm sure lots of people are just invested in those companies, maybe without even knowing. So I mentioned earlier that CR's California chapters are involved in a statewide prison closure campaign, and that's been a coalitional effort going on for a little over 5 years now. So really fierce, years-long organizing has prompted several California prisons to be closed or named for closure since the beginning of the campaign. One facility, California City Correctional Facility, was closed in 2024, which that's great. However, this administration and the one before it were eyeballing closed West Coast prisons to reopen as ICE detention centers. So, highly unfortunately, last year, ICE ultimately entered into a contract with Core Civic and reopened that California City prison as an ICE detention center, just bypassing lots of the required permits and lots of the usual red tape. So, of course, a lot of community backlash against that, and movement partners led by the Dolores Huerta Foundation have been fighting this repurposing since, and we've been trying to boost those efforts. Um, and if we could move to the next slide, I forgot to mention that before. So you can see a little bit about that on the right. There's a similar repurposing project potentially taking shape for a former federal prison in Dublin, California, that movement partners such as the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and others are fighting against as well. And those are the images on the left. And so I just wanted to offer one set of examples of how the prison industrial complex doesn't stop at just prisons, and how the investments purposefully or inadvertently made into prisons can seep into other facets, such as immigrant detention, which I know there's a lot of attention around right now, and rightfully so. Um, so this happens similarly with policing and surveillance. I'm sure you are familiar with Palantir, the global company, or maybe even Flock Safety across the country. Those are a couple different companies working with governments at many levels, local, state, national, and even globally, to surveil and criminalize our communities that lots of local um, police departments have been getting in bed with. There's much more that I could flesh out there, but just wanted to give a couple other examples of the ways that companies and corporations are constantly working with state actors to increase the reach of the prison industrial complex, and that they are all important. So we can pause the screen share for now, keeping an eye on time. But that's just a brief introduction into how both private and state carceral industries are deeply, deeply connected. And wanted to use this as a moment to highlight the repercussions of these industries just having so much resourcing. And of course, just wanted to get you all thinking about how a comprehensive understanding of the prison industrial complex can stack up against your mission and principles. So, if your organization is committed to not holding on to investments that involve prisons, I just really hope this prompts you to think about how immigrant detention or surveillance or policing are also part and parcel of those same systems. And so, ultimately, we see that the connections between corporate and state interests have unfortunate ripple effects, as with that California prison that was closed and now reopened as an immigrant detention center. However, divestments from companies like these have really important after effects too. For instance, the fewer resources Core Civic has, the less able they are to make a government bid for a budding immigrant detention facility or a bid to use existing prison and jail space to cage immigrants. And the less space there is to cage immigrants, the less feasible it is to arrest folks and snatch them up off the streets if there's nowhere to put them. Um, and so, the fewer resources that the prison industrial complex has, the less capable these systems are of attacking people that are just fighting against constant war making or fighting for reproductive justice, ecological restoration, better working conditions, and more. The fewer resources available to these systems of the prison industrial complex, the less capable it is and coming for all of us for dissent, protest, migration, survival, and sheer existence. So there are many ways to chip away at these systems of imprisonment, criminalization, and targeting that I'm sure all of us in this room today have some amount of concern about, or we wouldn't be sharing this space together right now. All of us as individuals and the organizations that we represent have some mission, North Star, or principles that guide us throughout our day to day or in our work, again, across a range of deeply connected movement sectors. So whether it's uh, contributing by on the ground organizing or offering direct funding to liberatory work through grant making, or even through ensuring that the investments we make or the assets we hold are aligned with our progressive values. Every single one of us has a role to play in not propping up systems of harm that are affecting communities globally. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the Just Futures team about some concrete ways to ensure that those investments or the ways that we engage with those investments are really solid and more in line with our principles. And again, that's just a really powerful way to chip away at systems of carcerality. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Yeah, that was a really fantastic grounding, and we're excited to get into it. So, whether we're talking about a foundation or a nonprofit with reserves to invest, traditionally there's been a separation between what we might call the programmatic side of house and where investment management sits. A traditional approach treats investment management as strictly a return generation process without consideration for the organizational mission. But there has been an increasing recognition in the field that there should actually be some degree of integration, right? Because those portfolios may be investing in the very problems that a given nonprofit is trying to solve. So this is illustrated in a very basic example on this slide. We have a foundation here who is focused on immigrant justice work. It may be that their grant dollars are funding immigrant rights organizing work, and at the same time, their investment portfolio could be invested in Core Civic, Palantir, Albit Systems, to give a few examples. Um, if you can move to the next slide, George, thank you. So those two tracks on the last slide suggested maybe some equivalence, but focusing on foundations for a moment and taking a step back, in 2024, foundation giving or grant making was at about 105 billion collectively, while overall assets increased to 1.6 trillion. So that means total assets are about 15 times larger than giving or grant making. And obviously, not all of the investments are going towards the most harmful companies. But given the size of this disparity, I think we can't ignore investments if we're thinking about, what is the overall impact of this institution? So, of course, that's where values aligned investing enters the conversation. Slide, please. The first element of the process we're going to address here is a concern that we hear about regularly, which is the myth that incorporating values into your investment approach necessitates a trade-off with performance. So we have a quote from Morningstar here. The biggest myth is the idea that ESG or sustainable investing must underperform. For folks who might be a little newer to the topic, ESG stands for environmental, social, or governance factors. So Morningstar is a very mainstream financial research company who's busting that myth here. There's a meta study that was done by NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business, examining more than 1,000 research papers, which found that the majority of investment-focused studies showed similar or better performance for values-aligned approaches compared to conventional ones. And we'll put the link to that study in the chat. We can share it in the follow-up email as well. And, I'm not saying that as you move along a spectrum of increasing values alignment, that there will never be a performance trade-off, right? But my point is that it's not this inherent compromise that so many people seem to think it is. Slide, please. I also want to address concerns we've heard that avoiding certain sectors could be seen as a breach of fiduciary duty. So, a fiduciary responsible for the invested assets of a nonprofit organization has a duty to the charitable institution and its mission. And absolutely, that includes prudent financial management. But having a duty to the mission goes beyond strictly maximizing financial returns. So, another way of thinking about it is that mission alignment represents an additional standard of due diligence. Even within prudent financial management, values related factors are relevant because they address risk, which is a key component, of course, of long term investment performance. And ignoring reputational governance and social or environmental risks may itself be financially irresponsible. To give one high-profile example, in 2023, Fox News agreed to pay a nearly $800 million settlement to Dominion Voting Systems due to false claims. And similarly, lawsuits related to discrimination, labor rights issues, pollution, or similar factors along that vein can detract from a company's ability to generate shareholder value. I am going to go ahead and pause here and hand the mic over to George, who is going to bring us into our next section.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mika. A hidden contradiction, a silent one. It's a moment of realization that many find unsettling once unintentional focus is placed on determining whether a portfolio actually aligns with their values. Now, today, we're using the ICE service chain as a case study to demonstrate, but this lens can be used to deconstruct contradictions that exist within any mission focus and related business sectors. Now, for a moment, I invite you to imagine a foundation, much how Mika did earlier, dedicated to immigrant rights or perhaps family reunification. Their staff is in the trenches every day, providing legal aid and perhaps humanitarian support. Yet that same foundation's multi-million-dollar endowment might be held in a broad market mutual fund or exchange traded fund that owns shares in a tech giant, writing biometric tracking software that is used at the border. Or perhaps worse, this foundation may even hold these shares directly. Now, this is a realization that might not be made without the intentionality to look for it. An unfortunate juxtaposition is that while such an organization may be hiring lawyers to defend asylum seekers in full view, on the surface, the tip of the iceberg, but beneath the surface, their investment gains were coming from the types of surveillance infrastructure used to identify those same individuals. This is a circular economy of conflict. And the honest truth is that it isn't a failure of morality. It's ultimately a failure of transparency. Now, standard institutional reporting is designed to show you growth and yield, but it's not designed to flag mission clash. Most boards simply don't know fully what's underneath the hood of their invested assets because that data is buried often under 3 layers deep in subcontracts and parent companies. Now, our primary goal today is to turn on the proverbial lights so that you can provide yourselves the opportunity to see the full room. We would love to see more organizations move from a state of passive contradiction to a state of active alignment. Because ultimately, when your money and your mission are pulling in the same direction, your institutional voice can be twice as amplified. Now, to solve the problem of exposure, we first have to map the territory. As Shirley alluded to earlier, ICE exposure is much more complex than simply just private prisons. Now, while private prisons are the visible core of the system, they are only at the top of a larger pyramid, as Shirley described. To truly understand the exposures in a portfolio, you have to map the broader ecosystem. Again, central to the full constellation are the detention center facilities themselves, the companies that own and operate the beds, for instance. This is the easiest part to screen for. But looking beyond, you see other layers. This is the infrastructure. This is where most nonprofits are exposed without ever knowing it. These can include blue chip tech companies providing the cloud technology solutions, the big data analytics, and the biometric AI used for tracking and deportation logistics. Now consider as well the telecommunications and logistics sectors. These firms provide the only phone service available inside these detention centers. And oftentimes they are charging detainees multiple times the standard market rate for a call to their families or even their lawyers. So for a social justice nonprofit, it isn't too difficult to imagine how even a small holding in this type of company could be demoralizing to staff and supporters. Now, there are additional other layers: logistics, consulting, food services. If your screen is only looking for the words, say, prison or detention, you are missing the vast majority of this full mapping. Now, the comprehensive assessment requires us to ask, who builds the software? Who moves the people? Who profits from the surveillance? And this slide represents the reality of the modern detention economy. As Shirley described, it's a multi-billion-dollar web of subcontracts. And the reality is a typical institutional investor is unfortunately very likely a part of it. Okay, as we've been discussing, the exposures that might be found are not entirely obscure, niche, small cap firms. In some cases, you will uncover business segments of mega cap companies in the S&P 500. A major tech company or giant consulting firm might have a multi-million-dollar contract with ICE. To that multi-billion-dollar corporation, that contract is probably a tiny fraction of their annual revenue, perhaps less than 1%. But to a given nonprofit, that contract could represent a fundamental affront to their organizational values. Now, when it comes to these large known brands, there is added complexity for a board or finance committee to consider. We think of it as a threshold of materiality. As a board, do you exclude a company for any contract or only if it represents a significant portion of their entire business? Now, ultimately, there is no right answer, but almost certainly we would all be better placed through a more informed answer. So, for example, a board may choose a zero tolerance policy for direct detention providers, but opt for a shareholder advocacy approach for a technology firm. This means that they keep the stock, but use the voice as an owner to pressure for change. This level of thoughtful nuance is what can allow an organization to defend their holdings to donors, to staff, and to the public with clearer confidence. If a staff member or donor happens to ask, hey, why do you own company X, offending company X? You shouldn't have to scramble for an answer. You should be in a position to be able to say, we know they have an ICE contract. It represents, say, 0.5% of their revenue. But we have joined a shareholder coalition to demand that they implement a human rights vetting process for that contract. Again, this is the difference between being a passive investor and a mission-driven leader. Risk profiles. So beyond a perceived moral disconnect, what is a more concrete articulation of the reasons a board or a investment committee should care about a values alignment review? Well, that can be translated into organizational risk. And these risks can be categorized into three specific threats: donor trust, talent retention, and reputational integrity. Think of them as a set of dominoes that you would never want to tip over. So first, let's expand on donor trust. So we are currently in the middle of the great wealth transfer, right? The next generation of philanthropists, millennials, and Generation Z are much more focused on impact integrity. They don't just read an organization's annual report. In a world of Google and AI, they may also gain access to a Form 990. They will want to know whether their donations are neutralized by exposures to the broader constellation of ICE contracts, for instance. And if a donor identifies a contradiction between organization mission and their endowment, they may not stop. They may have to stop their giving. They may also lose faith in leadership and effectiveness. Second, talent. Staff is almost undoubtedly mission-driven. Imagine the blow to morale when a program director at a mission-focused nonprofit discovers their employer's endowment is benefiting from the very detention centers they fight. It can lead to decreased productivity, burnout, or even turnover. And in a competitive labor market, it's a legitimate offsetting cost to have your portfolio working against your most valuable of resources, your human ones. And last, reputation. We live in an era of radical transparency. A single social media thread or a watchdog report about a nonprofit's investment holdings can go viral in just hours, sometimes even minutes. And at that point, an organization would be forced to move into crisis management mode, potentially spending thousands on public relations. And that's on top of countless of hours of distraction, having to explain a conflict that could have been prevented with a simple policy update. There's an old English saying, trust arrives on foot, but leaves on a horse. Reputation is an asset. It's earned over the course of time, and you should not let your portfolio devalue that. Okay. Once you identify exposure, what do we do? Well, it's not a binary choice. It's a spectrum of action. And so, generally speaking, we like to think of it as three tools at our disposal: negative screening, positive tilting, and active ownership. Negative screening is the divest option, simply saying, we will not own this. This is the cleanest break and perhaps the most straightforward for boards with, let's call it, strict red lines. Then there is positive tilting. This can be a helpful decision-making tool to help clarify exposures within the same business sector. For example, let's imagine two tech companies. Both of them provide cloud services, but one has a formal policy against selling surveillance tech to agencies with human rights concerns. That is the company we would prefer to overweight. And we aren't just avoiding the bad, we are also trying to support the better or the good. And finally, there is active ownership or shareholder advocacy, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll also expand upon a little bit more in the next slide. This means not just taking ownership of the stock, it also assumes the responsibility to change the company from within. This, in the long run, can help create a more resilient portfolio because you are contributing to an effort to have that company assume a more ethical foresight. You want such companies to be less likely to face future issues like the types of expensive litigation that Mika mentioned earlier, or be prone to public boycotts. Now, with each of these three options, you are moving from being a passive passenger in the market to being an active driver of corporate standards. And taking this approach, you aren't just aligning your portfolio, you are signaling to the global market exactly what kind of corporate behavior you value as an institutional investor. Okay, so let me expand a little bit more on what I meant by shareholder advocacy. Your endowment isn't just a giant piggy bank. It can also mean a seat at the table. As a shareholder, you have a legal right to vote on corporate board members and policy resolutions in these proxy votes. It's probably fair to say that many nonprofit investors don't give the proxy ballots the amount of attention it truly deserves. And unfortunately, that becomes a potentially wasted institutional asset. Let me share two quick stories. A few years ago, a coalition of faith-based investors and small nonprofits owned Amazon and Microsoft shares intentionally. They didn't sell them off once they heard about the types of contracts that they held. Instead, they walked into the boardrooms and said, as owners, we are concerned that your facial recognition software is being used in ways that violate human rights. And because they represented a more unified front of ownership, combined with the attention from the press and other events surrounding the critical, aggressive policing, they forced these tech giants to conduct human rights impact assessments for the first time. And in the case of Amazon, a moratorium in the use of certain surveillance tools in police work. In 2019, nonprofits used their status as bank shareholders to pressure JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and other big lending institutions. And they didn't just complain. They told the banks that the reputational risk of funding private prisons was far too high for a modern financial institution of their stature. For these financial institutions, it became an example of reclassification of risk. Within a single year, a domino effect occurred. Prior to 2019, banks viewed private prisons as a safe government-backed revenue source. After 2019, they view them as a high reputational risk overall. And as a result, over 80% of the private prison industry's revolving credit financing evaporated. Now, the banks didn't leave because private prisons became suddenly unprofitable. They left because their owners, their shareholders, like the nonprofits, here in the audience, made it clear that the social cost outweighed the interest income. And this didn't happen because of a new law or a government regulation. It happened because shareholders moved the needle. And this is why we tell our clients, don't just walk away from the table. If you have a seat, use it. Whether your endowment is $1 million or $100 million, when you join a coalition, your voice becomes part of a multi-billion-dollar demand for accountability. So something simple that you can do today, assuming you own shares of individual companies, ask your advisor whether they are voting your proxies to align with your mission, or are they just clicking agree with management because it's the more typical path of least resistance. Okay, a little bit on portfolio construction. So let's talk about the financial mechanics behind building an aligned portfolio. A common question from investment committees is, by narrowing our universe of investable stocks, aren't we inherently increasing our risk or capping our upside? And while we cannot and should not predict that any specific mission-aligned strategy will outperform a standard benchmark, we can talk about the methodology of how we build these portfolios. Now, we're looking broadly at a risk reduction framework. The goal of an aligned portfolio isn't to find a magical stock holding. It is to perform a deeper level of quality control by identifying and mitigating what you might refer to as drama risk control. Think about why a stock price might suddenly change in value. It's often due to event risk, a massive lawsuit, a sudden regulatory shift, or a public buyout that damages a brand's long-term contract viability. Companies with heavy reliance on controversial government contracts, like those in the ICE service chain, are structurally more exposed to these types of volatility. From a portfolio construction standpoint, we utilize a form of optimization. For example, if we identify a tech firm with significant human rights controversy, we don't just leave a giant hole in the portfolio. We look for a peer match, another company, ideally in the same sector, but perhaps in the consumer side, with a similar market cap, a similar risk return profile, or a similar dividend yield, but with a cleaner governance record. Again, risk management. By swapping a high controversy firm for a lower controversy peer, we are attempting to maintain the same market exposure while reducing the singular risk associated with those specific types of contracts. You are still participating in the growth of the tech or logistics sector, but you are choosing the vehicles that have a lower exposure to the social and regulatory friction that we've been discussing today. Now, the essence of this approach is to recognize that values alignment and risk alignment are often the same thing. We are seeking to build a portfolio that is more resilient because it's less tethered to systemic controversies. So in your next portfolio review, I invite you to consider whether the companies that you are reviewing, that you are examining and discussing, are resilient enough to withstand the next wave of social and regulatory scrutiny. So much in that same spirit, think about an IPS audit. Now, an IPS audit for um, board members and leadership, here in the Zoom today, this might be the most important and relevant topic. Your investment policy statement, or IPS, can be viewed as a legally binding constitution of your entire endowment. It is the document that tells your advisor exactly what they are allowed and required to do. If your IPS doesn't make mention of mission alignment or ethical parameters, your advisor is essentially required by their own fiduciary duty to effectively ignore your values and focus solely on the financial benchmark. I recommend to anyone here that has access to your organization's IPS that after you log off from the webinar, you double click on it and look for specific phrases that coincide with your organization's core purpose and values. You may search the environment, human rights, climate justice, or you can maybe even be more straightforward and search for mission alignment. If those phrases are missing, your advisor effectively does not have any mandate to, for example, screen for ICE contracts or any other value-centric issue. Now, when we work with clients, we help committees draft version 2.0 of their IPS. This can include a language that defines red lines, clear sectors that they will not own, such as private detention. Thresholds, percentage of revenue a company can derive from a controversial contract before they consider taking action. And proxy mandates, requiring the advisor to vote proxies in a way that reflects the organization's public-facing work. This is where your values move from a nice-to-have conversation into the realm of active governance. It helps ensures that your organizational integrity is baked into your paperwork. This is how you protect the mission long after the current board has moved on. Paperwork is where the permanent change happens. If it isn't in the IPS, it doesn't truly exist. Meek, if you could, bring
All
us
right.
into a final word on questions that they should be asking.
Yeah. Thank you so much, George. Yeah, I'm just going to bring us home before we move over to the Q&A. So in that either investment committee or board or finance committee conversation, whoever owns the governance around your investment policy statement, we wanted to leave you with a few examples of questions that you can be asking. So the first here is there a mission gap? Right? If this hasn't already been a part of your process, you want to get a holdings level review of the exposure that you might have to, in this case, detention or surveillance related industries. Your list might be broader than that. And we're going to put in the chat right now some resources from organizations that compile companies who are complicit in immigrant detention, deportation, and surveillance as a resource that you can use to bring to that screening process. The second question is the IPS a living document, right? Does it reflect current organizational values and risks? And then finally, is our advisor a partner or just a provider, right? Are they able to proactively identify controversies and alignment risks? Do they understand our mission? And you'll note that these are leadership and governance questions, right? Not just investment questions. So with that, we are going to shift to Q&A, but first, we actually have a question for you. There's a range of folks who are on this call, some friends of Just Futures who have been engaged in this work for years already, and hopefully some other folks who are just thinking about this for the first time. This was sort of 101 introduction to the topic, but we'd love to hear from you. If we're going to do a part 2 or release additional resources, do some kind of follow-up, what topics would you want us to cover? Where would you want us to go more in depth? We'd love to hear thoughts from you on that. Um, so moving now into the Q&A section, we're going to bring our colleague Cisco Garcia, who's our Director of Investments here at Just Futures, who has been helping to answer some of the questions as we go to support with facilitating the last few minutes of Q&A we have live here.
Thanks, Mika. So we had tons of good questions and wide-ranging in topic. I answered several, and so I hope everyone is able to jump into the Q&A, see responses, make sure they don't have any follow-ups or anything like that. But there's two remaining that I did want to highlight in person. And before I get to that, I wanted to just highlight one that was answered. Over text, but it's one that comes up often, and I just want to highlight it and clarify. So the question from the participant is, I know a tiny bit about B Corp companies and the ESG, but beyond those, how are investments tagged with issues and the stances that we care about? As an example, there may be healthcare investments, but how do we know which ones have the political stance we would want to support? For example, which ones are banning gender affirming care? So one thing to note is, we really are in many ways subject to the information that is publicly available, publicly reported. So folks have mentioned different ways to sort of identify that information, but just to summarize how Just Futures does it for most of our investments, specifically with the publicly traded ETFs and mutual funds. We use a tool that sort of consolidates third-party data. And when I say third-party, it means the data is sourced from the companies to the SEC, to organizations like AFSC, as opposed to self-reported by those companies. We specifically use 80 metrics, and those 80 metrics roll up into themes. Those themes can include, for example, the prison industrial complex. The gender affirming care, for example, is actually a metric that we track. But ultimately, we rely on this information being readily available by reliable sources, easily quantifiable, that allows us to sort of in a scalable way evaluate ETFs and mutual funds. But certainly, there are probably topics and metrics that we would love to, further understand about companies and holdings that might just not be easily collected or readily available. Okay. And I see there's a third question that came in, but let me just go in order. So, question from a participant, how does the concentration of wealth contribute to carcerality? If investments have financial returns that further the concentration of wealth, is it possible that those investments can be dismantling the prison industrial complex? I think Shirley, the Just Futures team, I think can probably add to this question, and feel free to name it if you'd like some more clarity, but that's the question we have. Who would like to start?
Shirley, do you want to start or do you want one of us to kick in here first?
I can. And this is a great question and a difficult one. All of these things have lots of contradictions and contours wrapped up in them. I think the way that we see it is like the prison industrial complex is mainly the protector of racial capitalism. And so racial capitalism and abolition, can they happen at the same time? And it's kind of yes, and we can just take small steps to get there. So I feel like even though if racial capitalism is still more generally maintained with concentrations of wealth, um, but there are small actions being taken to shrink and starve, again, the weapons, tools, practices of the prison industrial complex related to racial capitalism, then I think it's still a worthwhile thing, but it's much broader in the ways that we're ideally going to move away from the systems of capitalism. So just broad thoughts coming to mind, but it's complicated and rather gnarly.
Mhm.
But that's a good question, and I wonder what you all have to say about that.
Yeah, I can add a few thoughts. I think to your point, Shirley, right? The first question is a little bit easier to answer. How does the concentration of wealth contribute to carcerality? All of the tools of the carceral system, policing, detention, surveillance, traditionally those things have been used to help protect property and wealth for the people who have it, right? And so further concentration of wealth, I think, is going to, bolster a culture, a system of carcerality. I think the second question, which you were grappling with more, I agree, is tougher. And the way that this question is framed, and please, whoever answered it, if you have follow-ups, we're happy to continue to discuss it. But specifically, financial returns that further the concentration of wealth. That's the clause that I would hone in on, because I think that there are ways that financial tools can be leveraged to actually create a more equitable distribution of wealth, to reinvest in communities that have been extracted from. And that's what we would like to see. But investments that are sort of in nature furthering the concentration of wealth, I think inherently are opposed to the idea of dismantling the prison industrial complex. That would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, and that's great because, the next question really ties into what you just said, Mika. The next question, doesn't maximizing profit maintain the extractive logic? And I have something to add to this too, but I'll just let you, if you have anything that you want to sort of tie that knot together, since I think the questions are related.
Yeah, absolutely. And I so appreciate this being raised. I think I think yes, and the systems are built that way, right? The legal mechanisms around, for example, how we think about fiduciary duty, um, are designed to sort of force. I mean, it depends, right? What a fiduciary means is different in different contexts, and that's part of the reason why, in this particular context, we defined it early on as being sort of an obligation to the charitable institution and its mission. But in some contexts, right, it really is designed to force the prioritization of maximizing profit, and that's built into the system framework. And so I think there are opportunities for folks to be creative, and really think about the opportunity that's presented as well to leverage the power that comes with the ownership of assets, to prioritize what we're actually here to do.
That's perfect. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I do see that we're at 12:59 for me, but any closing remarks from you, Mika?
Yes, as we wrap up here, just wanted to assure folks that we will be sending out a follow-up email. We'll share a recording of this webinar, a copy of the slides. I think in the chat right now, probably we are dropping our contact information, so that you can get in touch. Thank you so much for being here, for the engagement. It was a great conversation in the chat around divest versus contest, and would love to continue that conversation. So, we hope to have the opportunity to, do some additional webinar, whatever the format may take, continue the conversation in some way. All right. Thank you.
You all.
Thank you, everybody.